What if I told you that somewhere in the archives of a small Belgian town, there exists a collection of paintings so disturbing that they've been locked away from public view for over 70 years? What if I told you that these paintings predicted disasters with such chilling accuracy that the local authorities believed their creator was either a prophet or something far more sinister? This is the story of Henry Dufresne, a man whose artistic gift became his curse, and whose canvases served as death warrants for everything he painted. In 1943, in the small town of Ghent, Belgium, Henry Dufresne was just another struggling artist trying to make ends meet during the German occupation. He painted portraits for food, sketched soldiers for cigarettes, and, like many artists of his time, he dreamed of creating something that would outlast the war. But Henry's talent wasn't just in capturing beauty, it was in capturing something far more disturbing. The first painting that would change everything was completed on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Henry had spent 3 days working on a detailed landscape of the old St. Beuven Cathedral, focusing particularly on the ancient wooden choir stalls that had stood for centuries. The painting was exquisite, every shadow perfectly placed, every architectural detail rendered with obsessive precision. When he finished, Henry felt an odd satisfaction, as if he had captured not just the appearance of the place, but something deeper, something essential about its very existence. 40-8 hours later, a faulty electrical wire sparked in the cathedral's basement. The fire that followed consumed the entire interior, reducing those centuries-old wooden choir stalls to ash and memory. The exact stalls Henry had painted in such meticulous detail were completely destroyed. Henry told himself it was coincidence. Wars bring destruction. Buildings burn. There was nothing supernatural about an old cathedral catching fire during a time when maintenance was poor and resources were scarce. But something deep in his mind whispered otherwise, and when he looked at his painting of the cathedral, he could swear he saw smoke rising from the canvas. 3 weeks later, Henry completed another work. This time, it was the Grassley, the famous row of medieval guildhalls that lined Ghent's river. He had painted them dozens of times before, but this particular canvas felt different. His brush moved with an urgency he couldn't explain, and he found himself adding details he had never noticed before. Scorch marks on stones that weren't there, windows that seemed to glow with an inner fire, shadows that fell in patterns that defied the light source he had imagined. On December 15th, Allied bombers, aiming for a nearby German ammunition depot, missed their target. 3 of the historic guildhalls were reduced to rubble and flame. Henry watched from his studio window as the buildings he had painted just days before were consumed by fire and destruction. The pattern was becoming undeniable. But Henry was not yet ready to accept what was happening to him. He convinced himself that he was simply good at predicting which old buildings might be vulnerable during wartime. Perhaps his artistic eye naturally identified structural weaknesses or fire hazards that others missed. This rational explanation helped him sleep at night, but it couldn't explain what happened with his third painting. This time, Henry painted something that had never been damaged before. The brand new German administrative building that had been constructed just months earlier, using the most modern fire-resistant materials available. The building was concrete and steel, designed to withstand bombing raids. Yet as Henry painted it, he found himself adding flames licking at the windows, smoke pouring from ventilation shafts, and escape ladders that seemed to melt under impossible heat. 6 days later, members of the Belgian resistance, acting on intelligence Henry could never have possessed, planted incendiary devices throughout the building. The fire burned for 18 hours, completely gutting the structure despite its modern construction. Every detail Henry had painted, the pattern of the flames, the way the smoke poured from specific windows, even the melted escape ladder, matched exactly what witnesses described. Henry stopped painting buildings after that. For weeks, he confined himself to portraits and still lifes, desperate to avoid whatever curse had taken hold of his brush. But the compulsion to paint places was stronger than his fear. Late at night, when exhaustion overcame caution, he would find himself working on landscapes and cityscapes. his hand moving almost independently of his conscious will. He painted the old Gravenstein castle, focusing on its wooden interiors and ancient tapestries. A careless cigarette from a German guard set it ablaze 3 days later. He painted the downtown market square, showing vendors' stalls and wooden merchant booths. An ammunition truck exploded nearby, sending burning debris across the entire market. He painted the Jewish quarter, capturing in heartbreaking detail the homes and businesses that had stood for generations. The systematic destruction that followed his painting was so swift and complete that even Henry realized the timing couldn't be coincidental. Word began to spread in whispered conversations. People started to notice that Henry's paintings preceded disasters with impossible consistency. Some called him a prophet. Others called him a spy, suggesting he had inside information about resistance activities or German military plans. But those who knew Henry best, who had watched him paint in a trance-like state, muttering words in languages he didn't speak, his eyes rolled back as his brush moved across the canvas. They knew the truth was far stranger and more terrifying. The local priest, Father Matthias, was the first to confront Henry directly. He had heard confessions from people who claimed to have seen Henry painting in his studio, surrounded by an unnatural darkness even in broad daylight, his canvas glowing with an inner fire that had nothing to do with paint or light. Father Matthias found Henry in his studio on a Tuesday evening, working on a new painting, this one showing the priest's own church. According to Father Matthias's journal, which was discovered years later, the conversation that followed changed both men forever. Henry confessed that he no longer controlled what he painted. The images came to him in dreams, vivid and complete, demanding to be transferred to canvas. He described feeling as though something else guided his hand, something that took pleasure in destruction and fed on the act of creation that preceded it. Father Matthias wrote that Henry's painting of the church was unlike anything he had ever seen. The building appeared exactly as it looked in reality, but with one crucial difference: it was shown in the moment of burning, captured at the precise instant when flames would consume the altar, melt the stained glass windows, and bring down the bell tower. The painting didn't show the church as it was, or as it had been, but as it would be during its final moments of existence. 3 days later, lightning struck the church's bell tower during a fierce storm. The resulting fire destroyed the building. Exactly as Henry had painted it, the altar consumed first, the stained glass windows exploding in sequence, the bell tower collapsing at the precise angle shown in the painting. Father Matthias barely escaped with his life, but he took with him a terrible certainty about the nature of Henry's gift. As 1944 progressed and the war moved toward its conclusion, Henry's paintings became increasingly detailed and disturbing. He began painting not just buildings, but forests, bridges, entire neighborhoods. Each painting was followed by destruction, some from continued military action, but others from seemingly natural disasters that struck with supernatural precision and timing. Henry painted a section of the Scheldt River forest in spring, showing ancient trees twisted by flames that seemed to burn from within. A week later, a freak lightning storm ignited the exact trees he had depicted, creating a fire that burned in patterns that defied natural forest fire behavior. He painted the old stone bridge at Portus Gonda, showing it cracked and crumbling as if from intense heat. Days later, a German retreat involved detonating the bridge with such force that the stones cracked in precisely the pattern Henry had painted weeks before. By this time, Henry had become a figure of both fascination and terror in the community. People would cross the street to avoid him, but they couldn't resist trying to catch glimpses of his latest work. Desperate to know if their homes or businesses might be depicted in his prophetic canvases, some begged him to paint their enemies' properties. Others threatened him if he dared paint their own. Henry himself was descending into madness. His journal entries from this period, discovered decades later, reveal a man tormented by his inability to control his gift and horrified by the destruction that followed in his wake. He wrote of hearing voices that spoke in ancient languages, demanding that he paint specific locations at specific times. He described dreams where he walked through burning buildings before they had been constructed, where he watched forests die before seeds had been planted, where he witnessed the deaths of people he had never met in places he had never been. The most disturbing entry in Henry's journal was dated September 3, 1944. In it, he wrote about a recurring dream where he saw his own studio burning, with himself trapped inside, his final painting still wet on the easel. In the dream, the painting showed not a place, but a person, Henry himself. Consumed by flames that seemed to emerge directly from his own canvas, Henry became obsessed with avoiding this fate. He stopped painting entirely, hiding his brushes and canvases, boarding up his studio windows. But the compulsion was stronger than his will to resist. On September 15th, neighbors reported seeing light coming from Henry's supposedly abandoned studio. When they investigated, they found him painting furiously, his movements jerky and unnatural, his eyes unfocused. The painting he was working on was unlike any he had created before. Instead of showing a building or landscape, it depicted his studio from the inside, with himself as the subject. But this wasn't a self-portrait in any traditional sense. The painting showed Henry surrounded by all of his previous works, every canvas he had ever painted, showing their subjects in the act of burning. And at the center of it all, Henry himself was painted as if he were made of flame, his body dissolving into fire that seemed to jump from the canvas to reality. According to witness accounts, as Henry applied the final brushstrokes to his self, the painting began to smoke, not metaphorically, but literally, wisps of actual smoke rising from the wet paint. Henry tried to step away from the canvas, but found he couldn't move, as if the painting was holding him in place, demanding completion. What happened next was witnessed by at least 6 people who had gathered outside Henry's studio, drawn by reports of strange lights and sounds. They saw Henry complete the painting and immediately burst into flames. Not from any external source, but as if the fire came from within his own body. The flames that consumed him were unlike any natural fire. They burned in patterns that matched exactly the brushstrokes in his self-portrait, and they spread to his other paintings in the precise sequence he had depicted them in his final work. The studio burned completely, but in a pattern that made no scientific sense. The fire consumed every single one of Henry's paintings of places that had burned, but it left untouched his earlier works, portraits, still lifes, and landscapes of places that had never experienced destruction. The fire also left untouched a single canvas that had been found, face down on Henry's easel dot, when local authorities examined this final painting after the fire was extinguished. They discovered something that terrified them more than Henry's death, or the supernatural nature of his immolation. The painting showed the entire town of Ghent in flames, but not as it existed in 1944. This was Ghent as it would exist decades in the future, with modern buildings and streets that hadn't been constructed yet, all depicted in the act of burning. The authorities immediately confiscated this painting and sealed it away, classifying it under a municipal statute that forbade its public display or detailed documentation. Official records state only that the painting depicts future municipal infrastructure in a state of distress and that it remains in secure storage for public safety reasons. But Henry's story didn't end with his death. In the years following the war, reports began to surface of other artists in other cities experiencing similar compulsions. A painter in Dresden who created detailed cityscapes just before the Allied bombing. An artist in Hiroshima whose final work showed shadows burned into walls from an impossible light. A landscape painter in California who depicted forests in flames decades before the great wildfires of the 21st century. Each of these cases followed the same pattern, an artist who began painting places in the act of being destroyed. With the destruction following within days of the painting's completion, each artist reported the same loss of control, the same sense of being guided by forces beyond their understanding, the same ultimate fate of being consumed by the very destruction they had predicted. Art historians, who have studied these cases in secret, suggest that Henry Dufresne may not have been unique, but rather one of many artists throughout history who have served as unwilling prophets of destruction. They point to medieval paintings that seem to predict the Black Death, Renaissance works that anticipate great fires, and modern pieces that foretell disasters with uncanny accuracy. The theory that has emerged from these studies is deeply disturbing. Some researchers believe that certain individuals possess a sensitivity to what they call temporal displacement, an ability to perceive future events through artistic creation. According to this theory, these artists become conduits for forces that exist outside normal time, entities that feed on destruction and use human creativity to anchor future disasters in present reality. The most chilling aspect of this theory is its implication that Henry's final painting, the one showing modern Ghent in flames, may still be exerting its influence. Municipal records from the past 30 years show an unusual number of fires in the exact locations depicted in Henry's final work. Though city officials attribute this to coincidence and refuse to allow independent examination of the painting. Local firefighters, however, tell a different story. They report that certain areas of the city experience fires that behave in unnatural ways, flames that burn in geometric patterns, smoke that forms shapes that seem almost artistic, and destruction that follows designs rather than the chaotic patterns typical of natural fires. These firefighters have developed an informal tradition of avoiding certain streets and buildings that match descriptions of Henry's final painting, passed down through oral tradition since the official records remain classified. The most recent incident occurred just 5 years ago, when a new apartment complex built in the city center experienced a fire that consumed the building in a pattern that witnesses described as artistic and deliberate. The fire department's report noted several anomalies in the burn patterns, but stopped short of drawing any supernatural conclusions. However, an unofficial investigation by local researchers revealed that the apartment complex had been built on the exact site Henry had depicted as being consumed by flames in his final painting. Henry Dufresne's story raises questions that extend far beyond a single artist's tragic fate. If art can truly predict the future, what responsibility do we bear when we create images of destruction? If certain individuals can serve as conduits for forces beyond normal time, how do we protect them from being consumed by their own gifts? And if Henry's final painting continues to exert its influence decades after his death, what does that mean for the people of Ghent, who live unknowingly under the shadow of a prophecy painted in fire and sealed away in darkness? The official records of Henry Dufresne list him as a minor wartime casualty, an artist who died in a studio fire during the chaos of 1944. But those who know the true story understand that Henry was both victim and perpetrator, prophet and destroyer, artist and weapon. His paintings were not mere predictions of future fires, but active participants in creating the very disasters they depicted. Perhaps the most disturbing question raised by Henry's story is this: somewhere in the world right now, is there another artist sitting before a canvas, painting places that will soon burn, unaware that they are not creating art, but destiny? And if Henry's final painting truly shows the future destruction of Ghent, then his death was not the end of his story, but merely the beginning of a prophecy that continues to unfold, one fire at a time, in a city whose people remain unaware that their fate was painted decades ago by a man who could only paint places that would soon burn. The painting remains sealed away. But fire, as Henry learned too late, cannot be contained forever. It spreads, it consumes, and it follows the patterns laid out for it by those unfortunate enough to serve as its prophets. In Ghent, they still watch the sky for signs of smoke, still wonder about the fires that burn too precisely to be natural, still whisper the name of Henry Dufresne when flames dance in patterns that seem almost like brushstrokes against the night. And in the municipal archives, locked away from public view, Henry's final painting waits, a canvas covered in flames that have not yet burned, showing a future that has not yet arrived, depicting a destruction that grows more inevitable with each passing day.